What are we talking about here? The best oily guys who fix cars in every Souls game? That would be a pretty weird and probably fairly short list. Game mechanics are make or break when it comes to how well a game functions and consequently how much a player will enjoy a game. But enjoyment of these mechanics can also be pretty subjective. Some players will love certain mechanics feeling like they contribute hugely to an enjoyable game experience, while others will hate them and deem the game as unplayable. To give an example of this from a non-FromSoft game, yes, that's right, I'm actually going to mention a non-FromSoft game here in this video. Breath of the Wild often draws polarizing opinions for its weapon durability mechanic. Basically, all weapons break after a certain number of uses and there's no way to repair them. Even the Master Sword has a recharge for a bit after enough usage. I've seen people online say they stopped playing because of how much they hated this. And I sort of understand it, but personally, I actually kind of like it because it forces me to use a variety of weapons that I would never normally use, and I like the resource management aspect of it, saving a good weapon for a fight that merits it. Anyway, back to the Souls games. As with many things throughout this series, FromSoft like to get quite creative with their mechanics in these games, often adding new elements to spice up the gameplay and combat. Some are home runs and some are not. So today, I'm going to list what I think is the best and worst mechanic in every Souls game. As per, let me know which mechanics you liked or hated in the comments below, and if you want to support some British dude aspiring to be a YouTuber, how about smashing ye olde subscribe button? You can even turn on notifications to find out whenever I drop a new video. So of course, we start with Demon Souls. I'm actually going to kind of cheat here because there's one mechanic that I think is both the best and the worst at the same time. I'm talking of course about World Tendency. Now, I was pretty hard on this back in my Demon Souls review video, but I do think the idea behind it is good. I often don't tend to do New Game Plus in these games because I don't really like just doing the same things over again, even if it is a little bit harder. I'd rather start a new file with a new build or do a no leveling run most of the time. With Demon Souls' ability to turn worlds pure white or pure black with the World Tendency, replay value is added and it's worth going through to New Game Plus to do this, so you can fight new enemies or get new items. The concept, I think, is pretty good, but the reason I also think it's the worst is because the way it's implemented in the game is terrible. For such a complex mechanic in terms of what you need to do to actually affect the World Tendency, it's so poorly explained. When you die in body form, you change to soul form giving you half health, which firstly is brutal. You can use the Cling Ring, which most players do, to give you 75% health instead of 50%, but it means one of your only 2 ring slots is now used up. So either way, you're at a major handicap. As a new player, in this situation, you'll probably then find the Stone of Ephemeral Eyes, and you'll feel inclined to use it so you can have your full health bar, but you probably won't know that if you die, it can cause these awful red phantoms to spawn because you've turned the World Tendency black, and it pretty much walls you off some of the levels, especially 4-1 with that red samurai dude. This almost feels like trolling to cause this to happen, as any first time player would logically use this item to get full health. I don't know why one line couldn't have been included somewhere to point out that this will happen. They didn't even fix this in the remake. I personally think half health for soul form is way too harsh, and the consequences of dying in body form is brutal. I see a lot of players purposefully killing themselves in the Nexus after fighting bosses so they can eliminate the chance of dying in one of the worlds and negatively affecting the tendency. No game mechanic should lead to players doing this. Overall, I think it's a good idea, but not executed very well. On to Dark Souls 1. So I could go on about the lack of fast travel in the first half of the game as a positive, but I think I've covered that pretty thoroughly in other videos, so let me hit on a different mechanic. I like the way that Estus works in this game. Basically, you have the ability to level up bonfires providing you have enough humanities. Initially, you can only upgrade them to give you 10 Estus, but after beating everyone's favourite Necromancer punching bag Pinwheel, you can upgrade them to give you 20 Estus, although this will cost a total of 3 humanity, plus an extra one to return you to human form to perform the kindling. This means you have to think carefully which bonfires you wish to upgrade, as humanity is fairly limited in terms of resources unless you want to farm the rats in the sewers for hours on end. 20 Estus can sometimes seem a bit excessive, but can be helpful for exploring later game areas or fighting some of the tougher bosses like in the DLC. Also worth noting, this was a massive improvement over Demon Souls' grass system, which could result in farming like crazy, and also set the standard for the limited healing resources you get from checkpoints in pretty much every game going forward. Conversely, the mechanic I like the least is Curse. So stop me if this sounds familiar. You made it down to the depths, you fall down a hole that you could barely see and get assaulted by these frog dudes and bam, you're cursed. Half health until you find a purging stone, which means you have to go all the way back out of the depths and then try to farm 4,000 souls to buy one, which is not easy with half health. Personally, I think half health is way too harsh for this, and needing to farm that amount of souls at that point in the game to undo it when you had no idea it was even coming is again borderline trolling. I don't think this is as much of an issue outside of the depths, as it's easier to avoid these enemies when they appear elsewhere, but to trap the player almost unavoidably like this crosses the line of challenge and frustration in my view. Maybe the most interesting game for this list is Dark Souls 2. They tried a lot of new stuff here, so there's many choices for both best and worst. My favourite probably has to be the weapon durability recovering at the bonfire. You also now have a weapon health bar on screen at all times, which is super useful. I have to confess, I always forgot in Dark Souls 1 to check weapon durability, and had so many situations where the weapon would break midway through a boss fight, which was crazy annoying, so I was very happy to have better visibility on this. I think it makes a lot more sense to have this restore at the bonfire, although I'm actually even happier to just not have it in the games these days. For worst mechanic, you probably think I'm going to say adaptability, and while I agree this is poorly explained initially, once you know what it is, I don't think it's that big of an issue. The thing I actually really dislike is the way hollowing works here. I'm really not a fan of any of the max health reducing mechanics FromSoft have included in some of their games over the years. This one causes your max health to decrease a bit every time you die. While this isn't quite as brutal as Demon Souls, I still just find it really annoying, and I don't think it adds anything to the gaming experience apart from frustration. You can use the altar in the Shrine of Amana later to return you to human form without an effigy, but having to sit through 2 extra loading screens every few deaths to get there is still annoying. Plus, Scholar of the First Sin slapped this respawning pyromancer in the way. Why? You can get crowns which stop this entirely, but that's only after beating all the DLC. Out of interest, does anyone think this is a good mechanic? Does anyone think this adds anything of value to the game? Let me know in the comments below. Bloodborne. Well, if you watched my video ranking the Souls games by combat, you might guess that my favourite Bloodborne mechanic is the rally system. Basically, when you take damage, there's a small window of time where you'll get some health back if you attack something. If you consider that the previous 3 games were Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, most players were probably conditioned to take a more cautious approach to combat, many including myself utilising shields. Bloodborne really wanted to encourage players to take a more aggressive approach to combat here, so offering a reward of health, sometimes a rare commodity in these games, for attacking more often is a great idea. It's simple but very effective, and I would love if they brought this back in future games. For worst mechanic, I gotta say blood vials actually. I don't like having to farm stuff, and unfortunately that's the only option when you run out. You can also buy them, but they get pretty extortionate in price pretty quickly. The way it works in the other games where you have a limited amount but they refresh at the checkpoint is perfect in my view. Running out while trying to beat a boss in Bloodborne and having to go off and farm them before you can try again quite frankly sucks. If I had to give an honourable mention, I also really dislike the fast travel system. Having to walk back to the Hunter's Dream first before you can travel somewhere else forces you to sit through 2 loading screens, which is super annoying, especially on PS4. Nobody wants to sit through that many loading screens, come on now. Dark Souls 3. So there's not too much new here, but I'll say the best thing is the embers. Firstly, dying in this form doesn't cause your character to deteriorate physically, which I'm very happy about. This means that all your time on the character creator wasn't wasted. Secondly, the max health feels like a bonus when you have the embers, and the non-ember form feels like your normal max health. Much better than cutting your max health in half unless you have a limited availability item like in Demon Souls. Honestly, I think they should still probably just leave max health alone in future installments, but this definitely was the best use of this kind of mechanic in my view. As for worst mechanic, I'm afraid I have to say the weapon arts, mainly because they just seem so pointless. I confess, I haven't tried every single one in the game, but those that I have tried never seem to do that much damage, certainly not enough to justify messing around with FP flasks. R1 is just so much faster and more damaging, there's just no reason I can ever see to try and use these weapon arts. It's a shame because I think Elden Ring showed that this could be done very effectively, but here it's just a very under-realised mechanic which pretty much nobody uses. Moving on upwards to Sekiro. So the best mechanic here I think is the perilous attack counters, specifically jumping and Mikiri counters. This adds an extra layer to combat, and the split second countering when you see the relevant symbol is a tense moment for me in any fight where I encounter it. I really like having specific counters for certain moves and having to realise when to throw them out. It would be good if there was something here for grab moves as well, but at least when you dodge them the enemies tend to be vulnerable for a while after. I could probably just add combat as a whole, but I risk sounding repetitive. Sekiro is a combat-focused game, and these combat mechanics work great here. As for worst mechanic, I wouldn't say there's anything outright terrible, but you probably know by now that I'm not a big fan of the lightning mechanic. Maybe I just suck at it, but it never feels smooth to me, and executing this counter often feels like a cluster fruitcake, where I never seem to be able to tell if it's going to work or not. It's the only combat mechanic in Sekiro that stands out to me as something I really don't enjoy anytime I have to do it, Divine Dragon being the one exception, of course. But overall, Sekiro is pretty tight, and I can't say anything too bad about most of its mechanics. They work pretty well in the confines of this game. Finally, Elden Ring. So I'm going to say my favourite mechanic is the Ashes of War. They add such variety, and I love the ease of swapping between them and using them to add infusions to your weapons. This gives the player so many diverse options to choose from, and really adds a lot to the whole gaming experience. Compared to Dark Souls 3, where they're pretty much useless as I said earlier, here they make up an essential part of the gameplay. Now, are there issues with some of them being way too powerful, like Flame of the Redmanes? Definitely, without question, but I still find them really fun to use and experiment with for the most part. Plus, easy access to infusions without having to have special rare smithing stones or feel like you're really committing to something where it may be difficult to change the weapon back after, really allows for free-flowing experimentation, which I love. As for worst mechanic, I'm actually not really a fan of the Great Rune Arc situation. I don't know if this is just me, but I just found that I basically never use these throughout any of my playthroughs. Rune Arcs are too finite, and unless you play online, which I tend not to, you can run out of them pretty quickly. Also, even if you do use them, Godric's Great Rune is so superior to all the others that I'm not sure why they even exist. Why would you ever use Rykard's, for example, to get health back every time you kill an enemy, when you could have +5 in every single stat by using Godric's? It just makes no sense. Even Millennia, the hardest boss in the game, doesn't have a particularly useful Great Rune. Basically, it just implements the rally system from Bloodborne. But why would you waste a Great Rune to do this very gimmicky move? If there was a consistent way to farm them offline a la Humanity and Rats in Dark Souls 1, it'd be better, but the drop rate for these in Elden Ring is very, very, very low, so it's just not worth it. A shame, because this is a missed opportunity in my book and feels like a punishment for not playing online. Well, those are my favourite and least favourite mechanics, but what do you think? Which mechanics in these games excited you, and which made you roll your eyes? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Once again, smash that subscribe button if you haven't done so, and maybe check out my other videos like top 5 gimmick boss fights in Souls, or best and worst area in every Souls game, both on screen right now. Have a good one, thanks for watching, and see you next time.